Okay, so very quickly, this is the presentation I gave, and it was focused on MENA production and its massive expansion to over 90 million tons for small grains. And we talked about the switching from grains to oilseeds in the EU, and we made a point about Black Sea grain prices and the divergence between the average FOB price and the FOB prices within the average. So US getting expensive because it needs to ration its demand because of its smaller crop, and the Black Sea MENA region having record grain supplies, small grain supplies of wheat and barley, anchoring down that green line, which is the Black Sea prices. Now, what we've seen in the last few days, well, yesterday, Friday, was a big jump in Matif wheat prices. So if we jump to here and we go to Matif wheat, you can see this massive spike all the way back up here to prior resistance around this 217, 218 level. So what we're going to be asking ourselves is this the start of something more sinister, more progressive in terms of grain prices? And off we go and we start thinking about the 230s and 240s. Now, before we start thinking about those sort of numbers, what we need to reflect on is the geography and get our geography in order. So ostensibly, what you're going to hear a lot about is the heat and the dryness in France. And you're going to hear a lot about the logistical issues coming out of this Kerch Strait. So we need to get our geography and our sense of scale in order. So first of all, this blob here, the Sea of Azov, is a relatively shallow sea. So you don't tend to see large vessels going in here. What you do see is a lot of coaster vessels loading in here, traveling through this strait, and usually going pretty short distance over to here to Marmara to discharge into places like Turkey, or basically into Turkey. Now, the bigger vessels will load here, Novorossiysk, Tuapse, which are the big vessels that will travel through this little strait here and on to the destination markets of Egypt, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, etc., etc. So right now, as of today, your problem is here now and not here or here. Now, what this means is about a quarter of the flow of grain out of Russia that comes through this region is going to be stalled. It could be days, it could be hours, it could be weeks, we don't know. Now, in a normal year, at this time of year, it would be, and I'll say it's not going to be impactful, but it's going to be more impactful. Why? Because this year, Turkey, the main destination for all this grain, most of the grain, is having a record crop. So its domestic need for the grain that comes from here is lower than normal because of its large domestic crop. So what it does is that it stalls this flow. Now, there's going to be two market reactions. One is support to the EU origins. So you've got your CVB, Constanza, Varna, Burgas, that are loading grains from Romania, Bulgaria, and the surrounding region for export here. So if you are a buyer and then you need wheat, or you've sold from here and you need wheat to execute, you'll pay the couple of extra bucks to get the supply chain security from this region. So this is supportive for the volume of exports out of here and the price here. Now, as we know, these are part of the European Union. So the European Union export program now gets a little bit healthier, hence why Matif goes up. But what's also going to be a market reaction is prices here are going to go down because they don't have this outflow. So as sure as the sun rises in the east and sets in the west, what we're going to see is two elements to this price move. We're going to see the price move up, especially on the European side, especially on Matif and on futures, which will be reactionary. But eventually, the market is going to solve the logistical issue one way or another. This doesn't stay closed forever and ever and ever. When it does, all this dammed up grain here that hasn't been allowed to move is going to be working really hard to win back the demand that it lost to here. And it's going to drop the price very, very quickly. So it's all about timing. The timing right now is that Europe gets support. this area gets pressure, and somehow at some time that whole thing unwinds itself. Now, the other geographical thing I want to talk about is corn in Europe. So we're going to hear ad nauseum about France and the bad crop there for corn. Now, we need to remember a couple of things to give ourselves a sense of scale. If you want to give yourself a sense of scale about French corn production in the US terms, it's like Wisconsin. So when you think about corn in the US, you don't think about Wisconsin. You think about Minnesota, Iowa, Illinois. Okay, Wisconsin, half the place is a forest. So France is equivalent to Wisconsin. Now, I can't remember the last time people built an entire bullish case around a drought or an issue in Wisconsin. So I don't see why we build an entire bull case around France. Now, France, the other part of this corn situation that needs to be considered is that the European Union produces non-GMO corn. We import GMO corn, but we don't produce GMO corn. So there'll be some parts of Europe that have very specific non-GMO requirements. So when we see this big divergence of the European price going up and other origins of corn not going up, that's the inelasticity of that non-GMO market, EU origin corn playing out. So there are buyers that simply just cannot replace lost French corn with US corn or Brazilian corn because they need non-GMO. But they need to find a solution. So what is the solution? So for the losses here, which could be from 12 down to 9 million tons, not disputing that, the solutions are going to come either from Poland, where they're producing more and more corn every year because the climate is moving the heat north, and Poland is one of the beneficiaries at the moment. One of the big losers is Hungary. They've nearly halved their area from 1 million hectares down to 600,000, and their yields have nearly halved from 10 tons per hectare down to 6. So what we cannot produce here is being produced more in abundance up here. So part of France's solution is going to be Poland, either coastal vessels coming from Poland, loading here and getting across to Western France, or trains loading here and supplying that non-GMO market that France may have served in Germany and Switzerland or Italy, and maybe even in France, train it to there. The other potential solution is what looks today to be potentially and on track to be record corn crops in Romania and Bulgaria. And again, you can load your vessels here and serve either the Spanish market that used to take French corn or supply it into the French market directly. So the French problem has a European solution. It doesn't necessarily have to go to other origins outside of the EU because it can't, because of the GMO, non-GMO aspect. Now, the other solution is that in Europe, and I think it's becoming a little bit evident now what the real impact of the high nitrogen costs during the spring are going to be. It's not going to be on yield, and the yields, as the harvest progresses through France, get better and better and better as you move north. And it's a record early harvest. They're going to be finished harvesting in probably a week or 10 days' time. So you can't do any heat from here cannot do any more damage to the French crop. It's in the silos. And I think it's not going to be catastrophic. What we're actually losing mostly is water. We're not harvesting as much water as we used to because the moisture levels are so low. The other thing that's relatively low in a lot of markets is protein. So the yields are holding up relatively well, but what we're losing is water and we're losing protein. And nitrogen is a big driver of protein, and the timing of the nitrogen supply is important. So the early applied fertilizer that a lot of farmers had owned prior to the price spike pushed yields along and allowed us to retain some relatively good yields. But what the lack of nitrogen at the end of the growing cycle, which usually pumps in the protein, wasn't applied for cost-saving reasons. And that's kind of a nice fit as to why the yields are doing pretty well in northern France, Germany, Poland, and the Baltics. Romania will have a record 14 million tons. Bulgaria will be probably a record crop as well. So the volumes are there, but the protein is not. And that, again, fits nicely this idea that the fertilizer was applied enough to support yields, but not enough to support proteins. So we're going to see this higher volume of feed grains in the European supply chain. Hey presto, that becomes a solution for the France maize problem as well. Feeders move from non-GMO corn to the small grains of wheat and barley. Now, the other thing then you say to yourself, well, is there going to be a milling wheat shortage? So in principle, yes, I can't push up the share of feed wheat without not pulling down the milling wheat. But the thing is the export market. The export market is pretty weak at the moment because Morocco is going to have a couple of million tons more than last year because it was satisfied or had a good growing conditions. Turkey is going to help solve this Kerch Strait issue because it has a record crop here. And in fact, if you were to stack the entire MENA region, Middle East, North Africa, from here to here, this arc, you've got over 90 million tons of small grain production. That's record by 10 million tons, and it's 35 million tons more than last year. So we may have these more feed grains here, we may have less milling wheat, but the destinations that want the milling wheat aren't going to want as much as they want last year. So what we end up really, when you look at all of this stuff and put it all together, is actually still a relatively balanced market. So that's why when we get this spike up, it's going to be an imbalance in price relative to this balance in S&Ds that we see. So that kind of it does substantiate this idea that we're going to see a big futures rally that we're seeing at the moment. If the Kerch Strait remains closed, we'll probably see more of this reaction goes up, but as quick as it goes up, it'll come back down. It's all about timing. So if you're building long inventories, you really need to be looking closely at what the futures can do for you and the options on the futures can do for you to protect the value of that inventory. So that's me just trying to help myself put my geography and my senses of scale together to talk to, through, and around the European, Black Sea, Middle East, North African markets. I think it's point made, so I'll leave it there.